Introducing a very important angle to the sustainability debate, the impact of transport on air quality and the knock-on impact on public health. Will Hicks is the co-founder and chief scientific officer of Air Aware Labs and has authored several highly cited papers in the field of urban air pollution. Welcome, Will, and over to you to present on personalising air quality for employees.
Great, thank you for the introduction, Graham, and good afternoon everyone from a rainy Surbiton in southwest London. So I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at Air Aware Labs, which my co-founder Louise Thomas and I established at the start of this year. So our mission is to personalise air quality data for everyone, but today the focus is on personalising air pollution data during the commute. Next slide, please. So why should we care about air pollution exposure during the commute? Air pollution is the largest environmental threat to human health, to public health. It is a global health emergency. It's responsible for over 8 million premature deaths each year worldwide. Both long-term and short-term exposure to pollutants like nitrogen dioxide, NO2, and fine particulate matter, known as PM2.5, have profound health impacts. For example, the tiny particles in PM2.5 are so small that they can bypass your body's natural body defenses, such as nasal hair, and they can enter the bloodstream. Once there, they can cause oxidative stress, which is potentially damaging any and every single organ in your body. It's not just the health impacts that we should be concerned about with air pollution. Air pollution also affects athletic performance and also working productivity. It's been estimated that air pollution exposure costs the UK economy £19 billion each year. While commuting might seem like a relatively small part of the day, it does result in a disproportionately high exposure to air pollution. So before diving into how this exposure impacts commuters, I'd first like to explain some of the research that made me really concerned about exposure during the commute. Next slide, please. So when I was conducting research at Imperial, much of my work was focused on understanding air pollution across various different environments in Europe. I spent a considerable amount of time measuring different forms of air pollution in high concentration areas, such as busy roadside locations, underground stations, and also in residential homes. Indoor air pollution is a major concern as well. During my PhD, we investigated the traffic emissions in London, Birmingham, and Manchester, and also in Barcelona. So to do this, we employed a twin site approach, measuring air quality both at roadside locations and in nearby less polluted areas like parks or university campuses. We were able to calculate the pollution directly attributable to traffic, known as the roadside traffic increment. We built a detailed geographical and temporal understanding of urban air pollution and quantified the sources and effects of traffic emissions at an hourly resolution and with a high degree of accuracy. Next slide, please. So here we have some of the results from the measurement campaign, which was done in London, where the focus was on characterising non-exhaust traffic emissions. So these are the particle emissions which come from the friction of brakes, tyres, and the road surface. So from the analysis of this data, it became clear that these emissions are heavily influenced by the local traffic conditions, such as the type of vehicle, so whether it's a heavy-duty vehicle, light-duty vehicle, the weight of the vehicle, but also the speed and the volume and the congestion levels, and non-traffic factors as well, such as meteorological conditions and road surface wetness conditions. So the London measurements were carried out over the lockdown period. So in these three graphs, you can see the diurnal daily patterns of brake and tyre wear emissions compared to the traffic volume, with pre-lockdown shown in orange and lockdown shown in blue. You can see on the left the plot showing the drop in traffic volume during the lockdown period, with the middle and the right plots showing the corresponding changes in brake and tyre wear emissions. So there are much higher traffic emissions during the morning rush hour periods, with also a peak in the evening rush hour periods, which is of course when people are out commuting to and from work. We also found that these traffic emissions are lower when it's raining and higher when you're carrying out, or when drivers are carrying aggressive accelerating and braking. Next slide, please. So the transition to electric vehicles is often proposed as a solution for climate change. And we've had today really interesting debates earlier on ZC3 about whether electric vehicles are part of the answer. And Graham also mentioned that their impact earlier on congestion. But the benefits of air quality are also really complicated. So yes, they don't have exhaust emissions, but they are much heavier than their equivalent internal combustion engine vehicle. So to understand the potential impact, I worked with vehicle manufacturers to build a model which simulates the change in the different types of traffic emissions as a result of powertrain electrification. The model included lots of different types of vehicles, ranging from subcompact to heavy SUVs. What we found was that overall electric vehicles are better for air quality. So as I mentioned, they don't have exhaust emissions, and they also benefit importantly from regenerative braking, which is where the vehicle uses a battery to slow down the vehicle, and therefore they're less reliant on the friction between the brake pads and the brake discs, which creates the wear and abrasion particles. What I think is key though is that this feature is switched on and it's as powerful as possible. So you need to have regenerative braking switched on as much as possible to get the benefits of regenerative braking. So we simulated lots of different scenarios, and if you have it on a low setting, it may not have a net benefit. There is another important feature to think about, and that's the larger batteries in the massive batteries in electric vehicles are much heavier than traditional internal combustion engine vehicles. So this means that there's a much higher level of road wear, tyre wear, and resuspension emissions, which are a big source of metals and also microplastics in the environment. So we've seen this increase with electric vehicle owners and drivers often complaining about that they need to actually replace their tyres more frequently. So all of this really highlights that air pollution emissions from traffic are here to stay, irrespective of the transition to EVs. Next slide, please. So let's turn to exposure during commuting, as commuters are often exposed to elevated levels of air pollution, particularly during rush hour when emissions are at their highest. So even though commuting accounts for a relatively small proportion of the day, it contributes to disproportionately large intake of air pollution. The level of personal exposure and the amount of pollution inhaled during a commute varies significantly depending on the mode of transport that you take. So this variation arises due to differences in surrounding microenvironments and changes in breathing rates while commuting. So over the past few decades, active modes like cycling and walking have obviously significantly increased, which is great in popularity. So they're much more cheaper, they're more environmentally friendly. There's no contribution to emissions, as well as, of course, providing that physical exercise. However, the increased effort and higher breathing rates during this exercise can result in a greater intake of air pollution, potentially up to 50% in a single day. So too many organizations and individuals are overlooking the impact of air pollution exposure during their commute. And this potentially leading to increased health risks as well as productivity losses at work, which can affect both personal well-being and also the organization's productivity. Next slide, please. Lots of air pollution health studies don't actually account for mobility in their exposure estimates, so they may underestimate the relative risks of air pollution by up to as much as 33%. So here we have a recent meta-analysis published in the Environmental Research Journal, which shows that the results of the studies which have analysed air pollution during active and passive travelling. They looked at 7 modes of transport within 52 studies spanning over 3 decades since 1990, and their findings were really interesting. So they found that walking emerged as the transport mode with the lowest exposure to several pollutants. In contrast, bus and car users would generally face much higher levels of air pollution. Although interestingly, bus users were found to be less exposed to black carbon compared to pedestrians, although much higher levels of gases. All motorized modes, including cars, are most highly exposed to gaseous pollutants. So while the level of exposure inside a car can vary based on factors like the quality of your air filter or whether the windows are open, the main issue is that air pollution often gets brought in from the exhaust and the resuspension of particles outside, and it can get trapped inside the vehicle, and it has limited ability to disperse. Public transport users were also found to have the highest exposure to PM 2.5, and I think this is something that those of us who use the London Underground can attest to from personal experience. But with diesel trains and buses, they also have relatively high exposure levels to PM 2.5. Next slide, please. So how can we reduce air pollution exposure? I've tried to break it down into 3 key pillars, each with their own responsibility for reducing individual exposure to air pollution. So a circle on the slide does also highlight that they and we should all be working together in synergy to reduce exposure and to protect public health. So of course, government policies can mandate cleaner ambient air standards, enforce emission limits for vehicles and industries. They can provide incentives for the transition to electric vehicles, or they can discourage wood burning and other major sources of air pollution. Businesses can adopt cleaner technologies like electric vehicles and encourage their staff to use active commuting methods or even avoid travel during the peak rush hours when pollution is at its highest. They could also introduce employee wellbeing programs like cycle to work schemes, which discourage car use. Finally, I think we as individuals play a crucial role. Simple choices like choosing to walk or cycle to work instead of driving or taking the underground could make a huge difference to your daily exposure. If we don't have the choice to change your mode of transport, you could have the choice in the route that you take or the time of the day that you choose to commute. Which brings me on to what we're doing at AirAware Labs. We sit in the middle of these three pillars, helping individuals, businesses, and governments to reduce personal exposure to air pollution. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, our mission is to personalize air quality for everyone. We've developed a platform called AirTrack, which uses real-time, high-resolution air pollution modeling and GPS technology to help individuals understand and reduce their exposure. Our base layer modeling integrates various data sources such as live traffic flow data, meteorological conditions, ground level monitors, and satellite imagery. We've combined this air pollution data with GPS technology to predict your time-weighted average exposure. The algorithms account for the time that you spend in a given location, as well as the relative physical effort to calculate the dosage of air pollution you're actually breathing in. For example, if you stopped at traffic lights, you might be there for longer, but your heart rate could be lower, meaning that you're not inhaling as much as you would be during the intense part of the cycling. Next slide, please. So we have lots of really exciting and interesting features which make the air pollution personalized to your exposure. So AirTrack is currently integrated with Strava. So you do need to record on Strava. And we heard earlier from Tom Knights about how useful that recording on Strava is for Strava Metro. We also heard how Strava has a really large proportion of their activities done from commuting. So our AirTrack data allows us to provide actionable insights to you as an individual, but also to companies, to organizations, to local governments, to pinpoint areas and times where being exposed to the highest amount of air pollution. These insights can drive interventions to improve air quality and protect public health at a local level and at operations levels and at planning levels. We also have an exciting roadmap to introduce lots of new exciting features to make the personalized air pollution data as engaging as possible for the end user. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up, we're really keen to connect with companies that are interested in understanding and reducing their staff's personal exposure to air pollution. So please feel free to reach out either to myself or my co-founder Louise if this is of interest. And thank you for taking the time to listen.